Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social Emotional Learning podcast, episode number 92. With neuroscience educator, author, and trainer Sarah Peyton. I'm so grateful to have been introduced to Sarah Peyton, a neuroscience educator and author of the book, Your Resonant Self, Guided Meditations and Exercises to Engage Your Brain's Capacity to Healing. I took one look at Sarah's work and website and immediately had 100 questions for her. She also has a workbook coming out to accompany this book this summer, so I'll put all the links in the show notes of everything that you need to do to get to know Sarah. As well as at the end, I'll share, and you can look in the show notes, the links to her free guided meditations that go along with the book. My name is Andrea Samadi, and if you're new here, I'm a former educator who created this podcast to bring the most current neuroscience research, along with high-performing experts who've risen to the top of their field, with specific ideas or strategies that you can implement immediately, whether you're an educator or in the corporate space, to take your results to the next level. If we want to improve our social, emotional, and cognitive abilities, it all starts with an understanding of our brain. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today to share your knowledge and your resources with us.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. And thank you for doing this podcast, which is so important to bring together that wonderful area of social emotional learning and neuroscience, which gives us so much compassion and capacity to see ourselves with gentleness.
Absolutely. Well, I feel honored and blessed to have this opportunity because with each guest that I do have a chance to interview, there's a lot of research and learning behind it. And the learning, it's more than what I learned with my university degree. So I feel very lucky over here for this opportunity to host and get to interview you. But I want to get right into the question, Sarah, and I'm going to go right into brain network theory because it's being talked about all over the place. And listeners of the podcast who follow the most current neuroscience research will have heard about brain network theory. Some people might have some questions like, oh yeah, what is that again? And I've talked about some recent books that have come out. Dr. Srini Pillai, he talks about the power of the unfocused mind in his recent book. And I've been working with Mark Robert Waldman. I interviewed him on episode 30, and he's been mentoring me for the past few years. And he's really dove deep into applying brain network theory. And I realize how powerful it can be to our life. And just to kind of give an overview for people, brain network theory and what it's about, if we're going to research the brain and we go to pubmed.gov and we search for the most recent studies to back up something we're looking for, we now get articles that don't just come back with specific parts of the brain. We're getting the actual brain networks that are coming back with the articles. So, Sarah, can you go over some of the brain networks that you cover in the beginning of your book and how these networks can help us to understand the world and maybe even improve our results?
Well, what I the network that I work with most extensively is the default mode network, okay. And the default mode network is what the brain does when we're not asking it to do anything. So in those moments where we've just woken up, how does our brain treat us? Where do our memories go? As we begin to move through the day, as we move into our shower or our exercise, those things we're often doing kind of, we've done them enough times that we don't have to think about taking a shower. So then what happens? What's going on inside of this brain of ours? And it can be these wonderful moments of that you're kind of gently pointing us toward with the unfocused brain, with creativity and harvesting and rest and rejuvenation. But if we've lived through trauma, then the voice of the default mode network is very different, and it's one of self-recrimination and blame and shame and like little explosions of horror. Like we can hit 14 landmines that are connected with trauma between getting out of bed and making our way into the shower. So the part of what I'm so interested in is how does trauma impact the way we live, and what can we do to heal trauma? And Ruth Lanius, an amazing neuroscientist, actually did a case study about a year and a half ago where she looked at the traumatized default mode network. And when she looked at it, it looked different than a non-traumatized default mode network. Like we can visually see the difference in the way this network is working, depending on how much unprocessed, unaccompanied trauma memory we're trying to live around. And I say live around because of that landmine thing that happens between bed and the shower. And what she had before and after pictures where she looked at the traumatized default mode network before what I call time travel and after time travel. And by time travel, I mean that we're kind of moving through to the trauma memory and kind of picking ourselves up and going, of course this was difficult. And, you know, is it okay that I'm here with you? And of course you were scared. And no wonder you froze. And would you like a little acknowledgement that the stakes were very high in this memory that you're stepping into? And there's an invitation to return for the traumatized self, to return to present time with us. Now, when we first start doing this, it's very good to do it with a therapist. It's very good to have accompaniment. And as we become more used to it, we start to be able to accompany ourselves and to notice these tiny landmines that are happening as we're moving through our day. And each time we do this, what Ruth Lanius' work showed is we're restructuring the default mode network so that we have smooth functioning and can access all of the beauty of the harvesting, the creativity, the rest, the rejuvenation of the unfocused brain. Andrea, I was focused on the default mode network. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, that sounds, that's right in line with what I was thinking. And as you were talking, my mind goes a million directions because I've just started uncovering a little bit of work with trauma and memories, specifically Joseph Ledoux. He's been someone that, do you know him?
Yes.
And so he's talking about a lot about how if trauma has been experienced because of the fact that memories are not real or memories are not showing up in the body, that we can reverse trauma. So this is a new topic for me. Can you just kind of talk a little bit about that, because of people listening that might have trauma in their life, or students or children with trauma?
Sure. So based on the research that was done in Nepal, there was very interesting research done in Nepal with boy soldiers who had lived through the Nepalese Civil War and then returned to their villages. And the Maoists took boys aged 5 to 15 out of their family homes and set them to work being soldiers. And the boys all had very similar experiences as soldiers. They lived through having their comrades die. They lived through injury. They lived through hunger, disease, trying to live without parents, and being far from home. But what the researchers discovered was that some of these boys had very bad PTSD, and some of the boys did not have PTSD at all, which then leads us to this question: what is it that actually creates trauma memories that the brain is carrying? And the implication of these studies was that the boys who came home to villages and families that received them with warmth and welcome ended up with very low rates of PTSD. And the boys who came back to villages where they were scorned, excluded, humiliated, pushed away, those boys had very high rates of PTSD. So what this points to for us is that, and I want all the listeners to understand that it doesn't matter what the event was. What matters is how alone were we, either in it or after it. Were we received with warmth after the event, or was it an experience of being pushed away by the people who maybe could have protected us or soothed us or comforted us or acknowledged us? So that's a kind of a funny definition of trauma, because many people are like, okay, a trauma is a car accident, a trauma is being abused, a trauma is a house fire, a trauma is an earthquake, a trauma is a terrorist bombing. Instead of saying the trauma is actually a failure of relationship. And once we begin to define trauma as a failure of relational connection, then we start to understand why it's so effective to go back and restore relational connection in connection with the memory of the trauma. Now, what we need to know about memory, I'm sure you've worked with this before, is that the amygdala, that is the home of trauma memories, the amygdala has no sense of time. It does not actually timestamp a memory. So all of those landmines that we're hitting between bed and the shower are bubbles of unprocessed, unaccompanied memory, times when we were too alone, that remain connected to the amygdala. So then everything that's happening around us is a possible stimulus for the resurrection of this untimestamped memory. So if I'm remembering a moment of humiliation when I was in grade school, then I may even flush, I may turn red with the memory, I may have elevated heart rate, and I may feel so alone and so ashamed in relationship with that memory because it has never been accompanied. Now, the beauty of the amygdala having no sense of time is that it actually receives accompaniment from present time with a great deal of willingness, because it doesn't say, okay, Andrea, that memory was when you were 6, so we can't go back to it. That instead it's like, oh, good, somebody's come finally to be with me and my 6-year-old self. And then in a way, it's almost like the amygdala can relax and let the rest of the brain, the whole network of memory processing and contextualization and understanding and making the narrative can then come online, and we get to make sense of these memories.
Well, that makes it so clear, because I've heard so many different ways of healing your past by making sense of your memories from Dan Siegel.
Yes.
And now how you've explained it, I understand it in a different way. I just heard, go back and forgive the past. Well, I understand that, but now I understand at the brain level why that repair helps us in the future. Thank you.
Yes, I love that clarity also. I was, the first time that I read Daniel Siegel, he was writing, I think, in The Developing Mind, or perhaps it was in The Neuroscience of We. He was talking about this moment where he was riding a horse and the saddle turned over and he hit the ground, and it was a trauma, and he began to work with it in this way. And I was like, this is fascinating. You mean we can actually heal our brains? Or it's not exactly healing, I suppose. It's just like restarting them from a stuck place.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so this kind of brings me into, let's extend default mode network here. I did an episode number 48 on default mode network and how it involves thought processes that include worries, doubts, and fears, like, don't try that again, it didn't work out last time, and so on. And Swiss psychologist Piaget calls this our inner speech. It can be positive or negative depending on what we're thinking. And chapter 1 of your book begins with how we talk to ourselves, the default mode network that talks about our beliefs and our self-talk. How would you suggest that we identify and then eliminate limiting beliefs that we have flowing through our brain?
The identification, I think, is almost like a lifelong process of starting to listen to our own inner dialogue. Mm-hmm. And that so we start out, we go, oh, I know I've got a critical default mode network. It tells me I'm stupid. I'm walking around during the day and I'm thinking, that was stupid, Sarah. Why'd you do that? That was stupid. There you were being stupid again. And so it's sort of like easy to catch those really blatant messages that are negative. And then we work a little bit with those, and I'll talk about how to work with them. And then we start to move into like deeper levels of almost like a nonverbal sense of self, which is negative instead of positive. And this also, both the overt negative messages, Sarah, you're so stupid, and the implicit negative message of just kind of a sense of shame walking through the world. And so many of us have this sense that we are not just right, mm-hmm. that there's something wrong with us, it's even more subtle. This also is a sign of trauma. This also is a sign of not having been accompanied. An example would be somebody who thinks that they are prickly, like I'm a prickly person and I cannot love. And what happens if this is some of the healing work, some of the beautiful work that can happen with language, if we start to notice that we've made an agreement with ourselves, and this is the book that's coming out in May, The Neuroscience of Unconscious Contracts, of agreements that we make with ourselves to not believe in ourselves or to treat ourselves harshly. And we have very good relational reasons for calling ourselves stupid or for believing that we don't matter. But with this example of believing that we're prickly so we can't love, it's like, what happens if we start to challenge that idea? If we believe, okay, this is a negative belief about me, so of necessity, this negative belief is not actually the truth. But I have made some sort of agreement with myself because, as you mentioned, Andrea, in the beginning, that the network holds these beliefs about the self. I will believe that because I am prickly, I cannot be warm. In order to, and then we're starting to use language and grammar to take us toward an exploration of what are the strange relational reasons that we have for believing that there's nothing exactly contradictory about being able to be both prickly and warm. I think most of us, if we think of the people we know, we do know people who are both prickly and warm.
Sure.
That we are complex.
What's interesting is when I first started looking at some of these contracts that I had, I've never called them contracts. I just guess I called them limiting beliefs. In my late 20s, I worked with a speaker, and you could stand up in front of a room and ask the room, what do you think of me? How do I show up in the world? And people can pick out what you feel about yourself, the limiting beliefs. They can see it in how you stand, how you speak. It's not a secret. So it's not like you know it and everyone else knows. This is how you show up. And I think the ones that I got told were, you don't think you're good enough. Mm-hmm. And that I've heard other people, because it comes up a lot. I worked on that for probably 20 years. And I believe I am now, but probably late 20s, I didn't. And so now I hear people saying, I've got this thing that I'm not good enough. My work isn't good enough. And I'm like, oh, I surely remember feeling that. And I don't know where it comes from. Where does it come from? Was it because my parents were rough on me growing up, or where did these contracts come from?
Well, I will not believe I am good enough. And then if we actually use grammar to help us kind of go into the right hemisphere and find out what the heck is this construction, I will not believe I'm good enough. There can be many different possibilities in order to accompany my mother, who never believed she was good enough.
Mm.
I will not believe I'm good enough in order to explain the contempt that my father had for me.
Mm.
I will not believe that I'm good enough in order to explain the contempt that my father had for me and himself.
Mm.
I will not believe that I'm good enough in order to belong to this family system where nobody really gets to have pride or satisfaction, because that would mean that we couldn't belong anymore.
Mm.
I will not believe that I'm good enough in order to be smaller than my siblings so that they are loved.
Mm.
There are so many options that are deeply connected in a very odd way with love.
Mm-hmm.
So many ways that we try to diminish ourselves or make ourselves smaller in order to be able to belong to systems that are carrying the after effects of trauma. What's it like to hear this, Andrea? Is this
Well,
making any?
you kind of have an idea of where it might have come from when you hear that. And then my only thought is making sure I don't do this to my children, making sure that, and I've heard you talk about the curse of the attachment theory at a 4-month-old. What about you've got children now? Can we still impact them now
We
with?
can impact our children all the way till we're 90 and they're 70. I mean,
Okay.
if you think about this, I mean, here we are, we're both kind of grown up, and your folks may be still alive. My folks passed about 10 years ago. And, but if I imagine my mother now being totally held with self-compassion and warmth, something in my body relaxes even now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm almost 60.
Wow.
So we continue to be changed by our sense of our parents in the world. And so the work that we do changes our children and gives them more energy and more support for their expression, exploration, movement, when we don't have to worry about our mother's well-being or our father's well-being. It creates a freedom and a movement of energy that's so lovely for kids of any age.
Good. That gives me some peace.
Mm.
So can we go into the default mode network? We could talk about this for days, I'm sure.
Yes, yes.
But how it's been linked to the imagination. So Marty Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, he calls the default mode network the imagination network. And my mentor, Mark Waldman, he created a diagram, which I'm going to put in the show notes, which it kind of maps out the 5 major brain networks. And he intentionally put the imagination as the largest of these networks. And he said possibly because it develops so early in life and plays such an important role in child and brain development. So just kind of leveraging off what we just were speaking with, why is it so important for us to understand this network in our brain with our early years of development in mind and then going through life?
Well, Matthew Lieberman at UCLA wrote that beautiful book, Social, all about the default mode network also. And he says that it comes online in the very first day of life. It probably is online inside the womb, I would suspect, and then continues to sustain us throughout our lives. So what I love most about being a person who moves through the world teaching others how to heal their trauma is that it frees the default mode network exactly for this, for imagination. Because the default mode network it travels between the sense of self and our memories. So it's able to harvest from our lived experience the things that create novels, that create movies, that create symphonies, that create hip hop songs, that create paintings and drawings. We are, whatever it is that we focus on and learn becomes available to the default mode network for harvesting. So this act of imagination is really an act of harvesting many different elements that we've been collecting that then get put together in a new way to create something new. And you may have run across this statistic before, and I love it. In many fields, people do their best work as scientists in their 20s and 30s. But when we're looking at the field of neuroscience, people do their best work in their 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. There's something immensely creative about holding the complexity of the human brain and being able to feel into it and to develop the mastery that allows the harvesting and connection of all kinds of different elements that then get put together into a new whole. Now, is this coming close to what your mentor has spoken about with the default mode network and the imagination?
Definitely, and he talks about how, just like you said, you're either in one mode or you're not, so it goes offline. So you're either focused on your imagination, or you're in your thinking central executive network, and you can go back and forth, but you can't be in the imagination network and your thinking focus network at the same time, right?
Right. Yeah. I think this is important for us as parents too, to know that we can't be both in our executive functioning network and in our relational network at the same time. That we can't both be telling our children what to do every minute and be expecting ourselves to have a deep and rich and juicy relational connection with them. It's very good for us to begin to understand our limitations so that we start to make room for things like imagination and relationship.
It's so true. Like, we know intuitively as parents and educators that play is where the learning happens. Yeah. And, right now out in my living area, I've got a fort and it looks a mess. She put it up, my 9-year-old put up a fort with tape. And so it's painter's tape all over blankets, and it's pretty creative. And I'm just dying for this fort to be put away. But she goes in the fort and does her reading and her work, and she's asked if she can sleep in the fort. And I'm thinking, gosh, I wish this fort would be gone. Because the tidy, let's keep the house clean and organized part of me, but just knowing that she needs that imagination to play and be creative and maybe go and do her reading in the fort instead of sitting at her desk like we're trying to urge her to.
That's a beautiful example of having to put the brakes on your executive function network that wants everything to look nice, and you're prioritizing a different network. You're prioritizing your theory of mind about your child, and you're prioritizing your relational connection, and you're prioritizing her well-being over your executive function in just this moment for this amount of time.
Thank you. It's taken a lot of effort. I tap my fingers as I walk by and I just can't look at it. It's hard, but I see the benefits. So I completely understand. And so this brings us to the next question. And on episode 53, I dive really deep into self-regulation and why it's so important to be able to manage our emotions, especially as we've seen as we went through the pandemic and having our children often at home doing their school. It's such an important topic, and I'm always looking for new ideas. How do you suggest we stay emotionally regulated as, parents maybe working with our children or even in the workplace?
This takes us directly into the work of Beatrice Beebe and her team. She's a researcher who's been working in New York City for the last 40 years, looking at close video of mothers and babies and watching the way in which there's an interplay of facial connections before words even come online. There's an interplay of facial expressions, emotional expressions. And what Beatrice Beebe found was that when babies have emotional expressions, that the mothers cannot reflect with their microexpressions. So microexpressions happen really quickly in like a 13th of a second. And so babies are in a facial expression to facial expression world before words even really enter. And what we see is that when the mother's face can reflect the facial expression of the baby, then that baby has an easier time with the emotions. So self-regulation being the management of difficult emotions. If no one has accompanied us in our difficult emotions, then we have a hard time with emotional self-regulation. This shows up so very clearly in the impacts of trauma, of the macro traumas on babies and infants and children, which we see with the adverse childhood experiences studies that show that people who've had trauma in their childhood, moments of unaccompanied horror, fear, rage, distress, even celebration, these folks moving on into their life have a more difficult time with self-regulation. So what we need more than anything else as humans is for somebody to be saying to us with their face, with their voice, with their words, yes, you make sense. Of course you feel that way. So here we are, having an experience of receiving, for example, a boss's contempt. We've got a boss, he's angry, he's upset, something didn't get turned in on time, his facial expression becomes asymmetrical, the contempt expression being asymmetrical, eyes are rolled, the contempt voice is used. Humans can tell if somebody has contempt in their voice incredibly quickly. Over the course of just one word, humans can tell whether or not there's contempt in someone else's voice. And that impacts us. Contempt impacts us. It impacts our immune system. People that are having to live, for example, with a significant other who's expressing contempt toward them, their scrapes and scratches take 3 more days to heal. It takes their immune system more days to recover from viruses. And so we know from the research that contempt really impacts us. So if we're receiving contempt and we create self-accompaniment in that moment going, ooh, that's painful. Of course you're feeling ashamed and sad and maybe angry and really alone. If we have like this voice accompanying us, an inner voice that we carry with us, then self-regulation happens. And we can kind of feel a relaxation in our bodies, because part of what happens when there's no self-regulation is that electrical feeling of anxiety in the chest. And sometimes, of course, when there's no self-regulation, we'll move into terror or rage or some other kind of intensity. But what we can really feel is like, just in this moment, we can all say to ourselves, just think of something you've been feeling lately that's a little puzzling, or that you have contempt for yourself for feeling, and you can just say, well, of course you feel shame. Of course you feel afraid. Of course you're feeling lonely. Or conversely, in the pandemic times, of course you're feeling overcrowded. Of course you would like to have moments of pure autonomy and aloneness. Or of course you need more togetherness. Just how is it for your own body to feel the of course?
That
Um,
kind of reminds me of Mark Brackett's work. He wrote the book
mm,
Permission to Feel, and
yeah.
I've studied him and we did interview him, and it was pretty powerful when he explains that when we can identify the emotions, something that many of us were not raised to do,
Mhm.
how you gain this understanding and calmness. And you explained it with the amygdala. What happens when the amygdala understands, it calms
Mm,
down.
yeah.
It's powerful to be able to identify what we're feeling and then perhaps move on past it.
Yes. And to tie it back to Beatrice Beebe's work, for example, with grief, if our mother's face can't reflect grief, then we stop making the grief face by 4 months. By 4 months, we limit our facial expression vocabulary just to what our mothers can reflect for us. And so, no wonder we become grown ups and we don't know how to even name our own sadness because it's not even been present visually in our family culture. So,
Yeah.
there's a reclamation of emotions. Yeah, as
Like
we,
some of the words like love,
yeah.
Mark talked about this. He said, we know what anger looks like
Mm-hmm.
because we see it, and you talked about the face of the angry boss. But what does love look like? We know what
Mm-hmm.
it feels like, but what does it look like? If you were to say, make a love face, most people don't have that in their background.
Yeah.
So does that mean that the mother didn't show love?
I think with love, there are a couple different like flavors. So there can be a delight flavor,
Okay.
and there can be a warmth flavor, and they would look different. And a little bit, this is because this takes us up into another exploration of networks and circuits. Jaak Panksepp's work about the circuits of emotion and motivation. So we've got feelings that happen, and the feelings happen on different circuits. So the care circuit is the love circuit. And when we're in the love circuit, then there's all different flavors of love. There's playful love and delight and warmth and sorrowful love um, and and um, and very quiet receiving love, and exuberant love where somebody throws their arms around you and squishes you. So I think there's a part of this that's like a wonderful step into nuance, because I think now that I've talked about those different flavors, it might be easier to imagine what the facial expressions are connected with those different flavors of love.
It's complex, isn't it? It's
Yeah, yeah,
not so straightforward. And thinking about anxiety now, it's an all-time high for students these days and
yeah.
for everyone else with what's going on in the world. And what are your best tips for understanding anxiety in the brain? And what are you telling people you're working with on how to reduce anxiety these days?
This is very much the territory of Jaak Panksepp. So what Jaak discovered in his research was that for mammals, anxiety isn't a specific enough word to actually tell us to close the circuit between the body and the brain. There's kind of like our body sensations are feelings waiting to be named and acknowledged. So anxiety is feelings waiting to be named and acknowledged. We often think about anxiety as a form of fear. But what Jaak Panksepp discovered was that anxiety can either occur on the fear circuit, or it can occur on the what he called the panic grief circuit, which is the circuit of alarmed aloneness, the experience of being left. We so rarely talk about this in our world. We often talk about fight or flight, fight, flight, freeze. But if we actually look at what are the different circuits that can be in an alarm state, we can be in an alarm state with fear, we can be in an alarm state with anger, but we can also be in an alarm state with panic grief. And this is our loneliness. We often think about loneliness as kind of a still pool that goes on forever. But actually there's an alarm state, a sympathetic activation state of alarmed aloneness, where our heart is beating harder and our blood pressure goes up, and we can feel this anxiety. Now, Jaak Panksepp wasn't a language guy, so he didn't walk around saying to research subjects, would you like a little acknowledgement of fear? Do you need somebody else to understand how much alarmed aloneness there is? But we can do this. We can use our words. He used medications. He used opioids when people to medicate anxiety. And when the anxiety was on the panic grief circuit, when it was alarmed aloneness, that opioids would calm the anxiety. And he would use benzodiazepines. When the anxiety was on the fear circuit, the benzodiazepines would calm the anxiety. So anxiety is not a one-size-fits-all word. It's a word that starts to take us towards self-understanding and self-regulation, but it doesn't quite get us all the way there. The words that we have that are connected to upset rather than to clear circuit connection don't allow the body to calm. So as I travel around the world, as I used to travel around the world before the pandemic, and I would teach people about alarmed aloneness and that their anxiety could be a manifestation of alarmed aloneness, I had so many people come up to me and say, I've been in a state of alarmed aloneness for decades, and no one has ever named it. And for the first time in my life, my body is relaxing. Just to be able to name
it. Wow.
Yeah.
Name it.
Yeah.
So would that be your most powerful strategy for releasing anxiety, would be to just be with it and know what you're feeling?
But to be with it and to track it to what it's, what is the actual emotion. And sometimes I've also found, this wasn't in Panksepp's research, but with actual people, I've found that people can have anxiety that's connected to anger, especially if they believe they shouldn't be feeling angry. And anger is something that people use so often that results in trauma because it can be scary. But when we really tap into, everybody's got an anger circuit, and it's meant to protect life. When we start to kind of tap into the life-serving power of rage and to link it to love, which really regulates rage when it's linked to love, then our bodies can settle also, because the experience of having an emotion that we don't believe we're supposed to have can also be a huge root of anxiety.
Got it. This is so powerful, Sarah. I could keep asking you questions all day, but I know you've got another call and I've got another call, and I know our time is limited. But in closing, what do you think would be the most important concept that you think everyone should know, whether we're an educator in the workplace, or we're raising our children, or we're just trying to find our place in the world and make an impact? How can we use our brains the best way we can and guide others to do the same? What do you think?
I think we need to step into and embrace the importance of accompaniment. That it's much more important to sit down beside a crying child and to say, of course you're crying, and to see what happens next, than it is to solve the problem, to tell the child that they're okay, to yank them back up to their feet. I mean, these are so many of the things that we do. We're like, just brush it off, brush it off. And we believe when we're doing this that we're serving our children in the very best way that we can. To begin to challenge that idea and to start to move into, of course, to start to extend what a mother's face does with a baby that creates self-regulation, and to extend it out so that we're sharing self-regulation in the way of course, with, you know, everybody that we get a chance to do it with. This would be the most important thing.
Powerful. Thank you so much for your time today, Sarah. For those who want to learn more about you, they can go to empathybrain.com and they can sign up for your newsletter there. And you do have free meditations to improve brain health and resiliency that are attached to your book. And they can follow you on Twitter at empathybrain. And are you connected to any other social media sites? I just have you on Twitter right now.
I've got there's an Empathy Brain Facebook, and there's a Your Resonant Self Instagram.
Perfect.
But if you go to the website, you'll be able to find
all of those. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for all of this. I'm so grateful that I had this chance to brainstorm with you and share this work with the world. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the work that you do. Bringing this beautiful information out to everyone.
Thank you.